The Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith, read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 13. I receive an insulting Christmas card. We spend a pleasant Christmas at Carrie's mother's. A Mr. Moss is rather too free. A boisterous evening during which I am struck in the dark. I receive an extraordinary letter from Mr. Mutlar, Senior, respecting Lupin. We miss drinking out the old year. December the 24th. I am a poor man, but I would gladly give 10 shillings to find out who sent me the insulting Christmas card I received this morning. I never insult people. Why should they insult me? The worst part of the transaction is that I find myself suspecting all my friends. The handwriting on the envelope is evidently disguised, being written sloping the wrong way. I cannot think either Gowing or Cummings would do such a mean thing. Lupin denied all knowledge of it, and I believe him, although I disapprove of his laughing and sympathising with the offender. Mr. Franching would be above such an act, and I don't think any of the Mutlars would descend to such a course. I wonder if Pitt, that impudent clerk at the office, did it, or Mrs. Birrell, the charwoman, or Burwin Fosselton. The writing is too good for the former. Christmas Day. We caught the 10:20 train at Paddington and spent a pleasant day at Carrie's mother's. The country was quite nice and pleasant, although the roads were sloppy. We dined in the middle of the day, just 10 of us, and talked over old times. If everybody had a nice, uninterfering mother-in-law, such as I have, what a deal of happiness there would be in the world. Being all in good spirits, I proposed her health, and I made, I think, a very good speech. I concluded rather neatly by saying, "On an occasion like this, whether relatives, friends, or acquaintances, we are all inspired with good feelings towards each other. We are of one mind and think only of love and friendship. Those who have quarrelled with absent friends should kiss and make it up. Those who happily have not fallen out can kiss all the same." I saw the tears in the eyes of both Carrie and her mother, and must say I felt very flattered by the compliment. That dear old Reverend John Pansy Smith, who married us, made a most cheerful and amusing speech, and said he should act on my suggestion respecting the kissing. He then walked round the table and kissed all the ladies, including Carrie. Of course, one did not object to this, but I was more than staggered when a young fellow named Moss, who was a stranger to me and who had scarcely spoken a word through dinner, jumped up suddenly with a sprig of mistletoe and exclaimed, "Hullo, I don't see why I shouldn't be on in this scene." Before one could realise what he was about to do, he kissed Carrie and the rest of the ladies. Fortunately, the matter was treated as a joke, and we all laughed. But it was a dangerous experiment, and I feel very uneasy for a moment as to the result. I subsequently referred to the matter to Carrie, but she said, "Oh, he's not much more than a boy." I said that he had a very large moustache for a boy. Carrie replied, "I didn't say he was not a nice boy." December the 26th. I did not sleep very well last night. I never do in a strange bed. I feel a little indigestion, which one must expect at this time of year. Carrie and I returned to town in the evening. Lupin came in late. He said he enjoyed his Christmas, and added, "I feel as fit as a Lowther Arcade fiddle, and only require a little more oof to feel as fit as a £500 Stradivarius." I have long since given up trying to understand Lupin's slang or asking him to explain it. December the 27th. I told Lupin I was expecting Gowing and Cummings to drop in tomorrow evening for a quiet game. I was in hope the boy would volunteer to stay in and help me to amuse them, instead of which he said, "Oh, you'd better put them off, as I've asked Daisy and Frank Mutlar to come." I said I could not think of doing such a thing. Lupin said, "Then I will send a wire and put off Daisy." I suggested that a postcard or letter would reach her quite soon enough, and would not be so extravagant. Carrie, who had listened to the above conversation with apparent annoyance, directed a well-aimed shaft at Lupin. She said, "Lupin, why do you object to Daisy meeting your father's friends?" Is it because they are not good enough for her? Or, which is equally possible, she is not good enough for them? Lupin was dumbfounded and could make no reply. When he left the room, I gave Carrie a kiss of approval. December 28th. Lupin, on coming down to breakfast, said to his mother, "I have not put off Daisy and Frank, and should like them to join Gowing and Cummings this evening." I felt very pleased with the boy for this. Carrie said, in reply, "I am glad you let me know in time, as I can turn over the cold leg of mutton, dress it with a little parsley, and no one will know it has been cut." She further said she would make a few custards and stew some pippins, so that they would be cold by the evening. Finding Lupin in good spirits, I asked him quietly if he really had any personal objection to either Gowing or Cummings. He replied, "Not in the least. I think Cummings looks rather an ass, but that is partly due to his patronising the 3 and 6 one-price hat company, and wearing a reach-me-down frock-coat. As for that perpetual brown velveteen jacket of Gowing's, why, he resembles an itinerant photographer." I said it was not the coat that made the gentleman, whereupon Lupin, with a laugh, replied, "No, and it wasn't much of a gentleman who made their coats." We were rather jolly at supper, and Daisy made herself very agreeable, especially in the earlier part of the evening when she sang. At supper, however, she said, "Can you make Tito-tums with bread?" And she commenced rolling up pieces of bread and twisting them round on the table. I felt this to be bad manners, but of course said nothing. Presently Daisy and Lupin, to my disgust, began throwing bread pills at each other. Frank followed suit, and so did Cummings and Gowing, to my astonishment. They then commenced throwing hard pieces of crust, one piece catching me on the forehead and making me blink. I said, "Steady, please, steady." Frank jumped up and said, "Tum tum." Then the band played. I did not know what this meant, but they all roared and continued the bread battle. Gowing suddenly seized all the parsley off the cold mutton and threw it full in my face. I looked daggers at Gowing, who replied, "I say, it's no good trying to look indignant with your hair full of parsley." I rose from the table and insisted that a stop should be put to this foolery at once. Frank Mutler shouted, "Time, gentlemen, please, time," and burned out the gas, leaving us in absolute darkness. I was feeling my way out of the room when I suddenly received a hard, intentional punch at the back of my head. I said loudly, "Who did that?" There was no answer, so I repeated the question with the same result. I struck a match and lighted the gas. They were all talking and laughing, so I kept my own counsel. But after they had gone, I said to Carrie, "The person who sent me that insulting postcard at Christmas was here to-night." December 29th. I had a most vivid dream last night. I woke up and, on falling asleep, dreamed the same dream over again, precisely. I dreamt I heard Frank Mutlar telling his sister that he had not only sent me the insulting Christmas card, but admitted that he was the one who punched my head last night in the dark. As fate would have it, Lupin at breakfast was reading extracts from a letter he had just received from Frank. I asked him to pass the envelope, that I might compare the writing. He did so, and I examined it by the side of the envelope containing the Christmas card. I detected a similarity in the writing, in spite of the attempted disguise. I passed them on to Carrie, who began to laugh. I asked her what she was laughing at, and she said the card was never directed to me at all. It was L. Pooter, not C. Pooter. Lupin asked to look at the direction and the card, and exclaimed with a laugh, "Oh yes, Gov, it's meant for me." I said, "Are you in the habit of receiving insulting Christmas cards?" He replied, "Oh yes, and of sending them too." In the evening Gowing called and said he enjoyed himself very much last night. I took the opportunity to confide in him, as an old friend, about the vicious punch last night. He burst out laughing and said, "Oh, it was your head, was it? I know I accidentally hit something, but I thought it was a brick wall." I told him I felt hurt in both senses of the expression. December 30th, Sunday. Lupin spent the whole day with the Mutlers. He seemed rather cheerful in the evening, so I said, "I'm glad to see you so happy, Lupin." He answered, "Well, Daisy is a splendid girl, but I was obliged to take her old fool of a father down a peg. What with his meanness over his cigars, his stinginess over his drinks, his farthing economy in turning down the gas if you only quit the room for a second, writing to one on half sheets of notepaper, sticking the remnant of the last cake of soap onto the new cake, putting 2 bricks on each side of the fireplace, and his general outside halfpenny bustness, I was compelled to let him have a bit of my mind. I said, 'Lupin, you're not much more than a boy. I hope you won't repent it.'" December the 31st, the last day of the old year, I received an extraordinary letter from Mr. Mutlar, senior. He writes: "Dear Sir, for a long time past I have had considerable difficulty deciding the important question, who is the master of my own house, myself or your son, Lupin. Believe me, I have no prejudice one way or the other, but I have been most reluctantly compelled to give judgment to the effect that I am the master of it. Under the circumstances, it has become my duty to forbid your son to enter my house again. I am sorry, because it deprives me of the society of one of the most modest, unassuming and gentlemanly persons I have ever had the honour of being acquainted with." I did not desire the last day to wind up disagreeably, so I said nothing to either Carrie or Lupin about the letter. A most terrible fog came on, and Lupin would go out in it, but promised to be back to drink out the old year, a custom we have always observed. At 11:45 Lupin had not returned, and the fog was fearful. As time was drawing close, I got out the spirits. Carrie and I, deciding on whisky, I opened a fresh bottle. But Carrie said it smelt like brandy. As I knew it to be whisky, I said there was nothing to discuss. Carrie, evidently vexed that Lupin had not come in, did discuss it all the same, and wanted me to have a small wager with her to decide by the smell. I said I could decide it by the taste in a moment. A silly and unnecessary argument followed, the result of which was we suddenly saw it was 12:15, and for the first time in our married life we missed welcoming in the new year. Lupin got home at 2:15, having got lost in the fog. So he said. End of chapter. The Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith, read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 14. Begin the year with an unexpected promotion at the office. I make 2 good jokes. I get an enormous rise in my salary. Lupin speculates successfully and starts a pony trap. Have to speak to Sarah. Extraordinary conduct of Gowing's. January the 1st. I had intended concluding my diary last week, but a most important event has happened, so I shall continue for a little while longer on the fly-leaves attached to the end of my last year's diary. It had just struck 1:30, and I was on the point of leaving the office to have dinner, when I received a message that Mr. Perkupp desired to see me at once. I must confess that my heart commenced to beat, and I had most serious misgivings. Mr. Perkupp was in his room writing, and he said, "Take a seat, Mr. Pooter, I shall not be a moment." I replied, "No, thank you, sir, I'll stand." I watched the clock on the mantelpiece, and I was watching quite 20 minutes, but it seemed hours. Mr. Perkupp at last got up himself. I said, "I hope there is nothing wrong, sir." He replied, "Oh dear, no, quite the reverse, I hope." What a weight off my mind! My breath seemed to come back again in an instant. Mr. Perkupp said, "Mr. Buckling is going to retire, and there will be some slight changes in the office. You have been with us nearly 21 years, and, in consequence of your conduct during that period, we intend making a special promotion in your favour. We have not quite decided how you will be placed, but in any case there will be a considerable increase in your salary, which, it is quite unnecessary for me to say, you fully deserve. I have an appointment at 2, but you shall hear more tomorrow." He then left the room quickly, and I was not even allowed time or thought to express a single word of grateful thanks to him. I need not say how dear Carrie received the joyful news. With perfect simplicity she said, "At last we shall be able to have a chimney glass for the back drawing-room, which we've always wanted." I added, "Yes, and at last you shall have that little costume which you saw at Peter Robinson's so cheap." January 2nd. I was in a great state of suspense all day at the office. I did not like to worry Mr. Perkupp, but as he did not send for me, and mentioned yesterday that he would see me again to-day, I thought it better, perhaps, to go to him. I knocked at his door, and on entering Mr. Perkupp said, "Oh, it's you, Mr. Pooter. Do you want to see me?" I said, "No, sir, I thought you wanted to see me." "Oh," he replied, "I remember. Well, I am very busy to-day. I'll see you to-morrow." January 3rd. Still in a state of anxiety and excitement, which was not alleviated by ascertaining that Mr. Perkupp sent word he should not be at the office to-day. In the evening, Lupin, who was busily engaged with a paper, said suddenly to me, "Do you know anything about chalk pits, Gov?" I said, "No, my boy, not that I am aware of." Lupin said, "Well, I give you the tip. Chalk pits are as safe as consols, and pay 6% at par." I said a rather neat thing, viz., they may be 6% at par, but your pa has no money to invest. Carrie and I both roared with laughter. Lupin did not take the slightest notice of the joke, although I purposely repeated it for him. But he continued, "I give you the tip, that's all, chalk pits." I said another funny thing. "Mind you don't fall into them." Lupin put on a supercilious smile and said, "Bravo, Joe Miller." January 4th. Mr. Perkupp sent for me and told me that my position would be that of one of the senior clerks. I was more than overjoyed. Mr. Perkupp added he would let me know to-morrow what the salary would be. This means another day's anxiety. I don't mind, for it is anxiety of the right sort. That reminded me that I had forgotten to speak to Lupin about the letter I received from Mr. Mutlar senior. I broached the subject to Lupin in the evening, having first consulted Carrie. Lupin was riveted to the Financial Times, as if he had been a born capitalist, and I said, "Pardon me a moment, Lupin. How is it you have not been to the Mutlars any day this week?" Lupin answered, "I told you I cannot stand old Mutlar." I said, "Mr. Mutlar writes to me to say pretty plainly that he cannot stand you." Lupin said, "Well, I like his cheek in writing to you. I will find out if his father is still alive, and I will write to him a note complaining of his son, and I'll state pretty clearly that his son is a blithering idiot." I said, "Lupin, please moderate your expressions in the presence of your mother." Lupin said, "I'm very sorry, but there is no other expression one can apply to him. However, I'm determined not to enter his place again." I said, "You know, Lupin, he has forbidden you the house." Lupin replied, "Well, we won't split straws, it's all the same. Daisy is a trump and will wait for me 10 years if necessary." January 5th. I can scarcely write the news. Mr. Perkupp told me my salary would be raised £100. I stood gaping for a moment, unable to realise it. I annually get £10 rise, and I thought it might be 15 or even 20. But £100 surpasses all belief. Carrie and I both rejoiced over our good fortune. Lupin came home in the evening in the utmost good spirits. I sent Sarah quietly round to the grocer's for a bottle of champagne, the same as we had before, Jackson Frere. It was opened at supper, and I said to Lupin, "This is to celebrate some good news I've received to-day." Lupin replied, "Hooray, Gov, and I have some good news also. A double event, eh?" I said, "My boy, as a result of 21 years' industry and strict attention to the interests of my superiors in office, I have been rewarded with promotion and a rise in salary of £100. Lupin gave 3 cheers, and we rapped the table furiously, which brought in Sarah to see what the matter was. Lupin ordered us to fill up again, and, addressing us upstanding, said, having been in the firm of Job, Cleanands, stock and shareholders a few weeks, and not having paid particular attention to the interests of my superiors in office, my governor, as a reward to me, allotted me £5 worth of shares in a really good thing. The result is, to-day, I have made £200. I said, "Lupin, you're joking." "No, Gov, it's the good old truth. Job, Cleanands put me on to chlorates." January the 21st. I am very much concerned at Lupin having started a pony trap. I said, "Lupin, are you justified in this outrageous extravagance?" Lupin replied, "Well, one must get to the city somehow. I've only hired it, and can give it up any time I like." I repeated my question, "Are you justified in this extravagance?" He replied, "Look here, Gov, excuse me saying so, but you're a bit out of date. It does not pay nowadays fiddling about over small things." I don't mean anything personal, Governor. My boss says if I take his tip and stick to big things, I can make big money. I said I thought the very idea of speculation most horrifying. Lupin said, "It is not speculation, it's a dead cert." I advised him at all events not to continue the pony and cart, but he replied, "I made £200 in one day. Now suppose I only make £200 in a month, or put it at £100 a month, which is ridiculously low, why that is £1,250 a year. What's a few pounds a week for a trap?" I did not pursue the subject further, beyond saying that I should feel glad when the autumn came and Lupin would be of age and responsible for his own debts. He answered, "My dear Gov, I promise you faithfully that I will never speculate with what I have not got. I shall only go on Job Cleanands' tips, and as he is in the know, it is pretty safe sailing." I felt somewhat relieved. Gowing called in the evening, and, to my surprise, informed me that, as he had made £10 by one of Lupin's tips, he intended asking us and the Cummings round next Saturday. Carrie and I said we would be delighted. January the 22nd. I don't generally lose my temper with servants, but I had to speak to Sarah rather sharply about a careless habit she has recently contracted of shaking the tablecloth after removing the breakfast things in a manner which causes all the crumbs to fall on the carpet, eventually to be trodden in. Sarah answered very rudely, "Oh, you're always complaining." I replied, "Indeed I am not. I spoke to you last week about walking all over the drawing-room carpet with a piece of yellow soap on the heel of your boot." She said, "And you're always grumbling about your breakfast." I said, "No, I am not, but I feel perfectly justified in complaining that I never can get a hard-boiled egg. The moment I crack the shell, it spurts all over the place, and I have spoken to you at least 50 times about it." She began to cry and make a scene, but fortunately my bus came by, so I had a good excuse for leaving her. Gowing left a message in the evening that we were not to forget next Saturday. Carrie amusingly said, "As he has never asked any friends before, we are not likely to forget it." January the 23rd. I asked Lupin to try and change the hard brushes he had recently made me a present of for some softer ones, as my hairdresser tells me I ought not to brush my hair too much just now. January the 24th. The new chimney glass came home for the back drawing-room. Carrie arranged some fans very prettily on the top and on each side. It is an immense improvement to the room. January the 25th. We had just finished our tea, when who should come in but Cummings, who has not been here for over 3 weeks. I noticed he looked anything but well, so I said, "Well, Cummings, how are you? You look a little blue." He replied, "Yes, and I feel blue too." I said, "Why, what's the matter?" He said, "Oh, nothing, except that I've been on my back for a couple of weeks, that's all. At one time my doctor nearly gave me up, yet not a soul has come near me. No one has even taken the trouble to inquire whether I was alive or dead." I said, "This is the first I've heard of it. I have passed your house several nights and presumed you had company, as the rooms were so brilliantly lighted." Cummings replied, "No, the only company I have had was my wife, the doctor, and the landlady, the last named having turned out a perfect trump." "I wonder you did not see it in the paper. I know it was mentioned in the Bicycle News." I thought to cheer him up, and said, "Well, you're all right now." He replied, "That's not the question. The question is whether an illness does not enable you to discover who are your true friends." I said such an observation was unworthy of him. To make matters worse, in came Gowing, who gave Cummings a violent slap on the back and said, "Hullo, have you seen a ghost? You look scared to death, like Irving in Macbeth." I said, "Gently, Gowing, the poor fellow has been very ill." Gowing roared with laughter and said, "Yes, and you look it too." Cummings quietly said, "Yes, and I feel it too, not that I suppose you care." An awkward silence followed. Gowing said, "Never mind, Cummings, you and the missus come round to my place to-morrow, and it will cheer you up a bit, for we'll open a bottle of wine." January the 26th, an extraordinary thing happened. Carrie and I went round to Gowing's, as arranged, at 7:30. We knocked and rang several times without getting an answer. At last the latch was drawn and the door opened a little way, the chain still being up. A man in shirt-sleeves put his head through and said, "Who is it? What do you want?" I said, "Mr. Gowing, he's expecting us." The man said, as well as I could hear, owing to the yapping of a little dog, "I don't think he is. Mr. Gowing is not at home." I said, "He will be in directly." With that observation he slammed the door, leaving Carrie and me standing on the steps, with a cutting wind blowing round the corner. Carrie advised me to knock again. I did so, and then discovered for the first time that the knocker had been newly painted, and the paint had come off on my gloves, which were, in consequence, completely spoiled. I knocked at the door with my stick 2 or 3 times. The man opened the door, taking the chain off this time, and began abusing me. He said, "What do you mean by scratching the paint with your stick like that, spoiling the varnish? You ought to be ashamed of yourself." I said, "Pardon me, Mr. Gowing invited..." He interrupted and said, "I don't care for Mr. Gowing or any of his friends. This is my door, not Mr. Gowing's. There are people here besides Mr. Gowing." The impertinence of this man was nothing. I scarcely noticed it. It was so trivial in comparison with the scandalous conduct of Gowing. At this moment Cummings and his wife arrived. Cummings was very lame and leaning on a stick, but got up the steps and asked what the matter was. The man said Mr. Gowing said nothing about expecting anyone. All he said was that he had just received an invitation to Croydon, and he should not be back till Monday evening. He took his bag with him. With that he slammed the door again. I was too indignant with Gowing's conduct to say anything. Cummings looked white with rage, and as he descended the steps, struck his stick violently on the ground and said, "Scoundrel!" End of chapter. The Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith. Read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 15. Gowing explains his conduct. Lupin takes us for a drive, which we don't enjoy. Lupin introduces us to Mr. Murray Posh. February the 8th. It does seem hard that I cannot get good sausages for breakfast. They're either full of bread or spice, or as red as beef. Still anxious about the £20 I invested last week by Lupin's advice. However, Cummings has done the same. February the 9th. Exactly a fortnight has passed, and I have neither seen nor heard from Gowing respecting his extraordinary conduct in asking us round to his house and then being out. In the evening, Carrie was engaged marking a half-dozen new collars I had purchased. I'll back Carrie's marking against anybody's. While I was drying them at the fire, and Carrie was rebuking me for scorching them, Cummings came in. He seemed quite well again, and chaffed us about marking the collars. I asked him if he had heard from Gowing, and he replied that he had not. I said I should not have believed that Gowing could have acted in such an ungentlemanly manner. Cummings said, "You are mild in your description of him. I think he acted like a cad." The words were scarcely out of his mouth when the door opened, and Gowing, putting in his head, said, "May I come in?" I said, "Certainly." Carrie said, very pointedly, "Well, you are a stranger." Gowing said, "Yes, I've been on and off to Croydon during the last fortnight." I could see Cummings was boiling over, and eventually he tackled Gowing very strongly respecting his conduct last Saturday week. Gowing appeared surprised and said, "Why, I posted a letter to you in the morning announcing that the party was off, very much off." I said I never got it. Gowing, turning to Carrie, said, "I suppose letters sometimes miscarry, don't they, Mrs. Carrie?" Cummings sharply said, "This is not a time for joking. I had no notice of the party being put off. I told Pooter in my note to tell you, as I was in a hurry. However, I'll inquire at the post office, and we must meet again at my place." I added that I hoped he would be present at the next meeting. Carrie roared at this, and even Cummings could not help laughing. February 10th, Sunday. Contrary to my wishes, Carrie allowed Lupin to persuade her to take her for a drive in the afternoon in his trap. I quite disapprove of driving on a Sunday, but I did not like to trust Carrie alone with Lupin, so I offered to go too. Lupin said, "Now, that is nice of you, Gov, but you won't mind sitting on the back seat of the cart." Lupin proceeded to put on a bright blue coat that seemed miles too large for him. Carrie said it wanted taking in considerably at the back. Lupin said, "Haven't you seen a box coat before? You can't drive in anything else." He may wear what he likes in the future, for I shall never drive with him again. His conduct was shocking. When we passed Highgate Archway, he tried to pass everything and everybody. He shouted to respectable people who were walking quietly in the road to get out of the way. He flicked the horse of an old man who was riding, causing it to rear. And as I had to ride backwards, I was compelled to face a gang of roughs in a donkey cart, whom Lupin had chaffed, and who turned and followed us for nearly a mile, bellowing, indulging in coarse jokes and laughter, to say nothing of occasionally pelting us with orange peel. Lupin's excuse, that the Prince of Wales would have to put up with the same sort of thing if he drove to the Derby, was of little consolation to either Carrie or myself. Frank Mutler called in the evening, and Lupin went out with him. February 11th. Feeling a little concerned about Lupin, I mustered up courage to speak to Mr. Perkupp about him. Mr. Perkupp has always been most kind to me, so I told him everything, including yesterday's adventure. Mr. Perkupp kindly replied, "There is no necessity for you to be anxious, Mr. Pooter. It would be impossible for a son of such good parents to turn out erroneously. Remember, he is young and will soon get older. I wish we could find room for him in this firm. The advice of this good man takes loads off my mind." In the evening, Lupin came in. After our little supper, he said, "My dear parents, I have some news which I fear will affect you considerably." I felt a qualm come over me and said nothing. Lupin then said, "It may distress you, in fact, I'm sure it will, but this afternoon I have given up my pony and trap for ever." It may seem absurd, but I was so pleased I immediately opened a bottle of port. Gowing dropped in just in time, bringing with him a large sheet with a print of a tailless donkey, which he fastened against the wall. He then produced several separate tails, and we spent the remainder of the evening trying blindfolded to pin a tail on in the proper place. My sides positively ached with laughter when I went to bed. February 12th. In the evening I spoke to Lupin about his engagement with Daisy Mutlar. I asked if he had heard from her. He replied, "No, she promised that old windbag of a father of hers that she would not communicate with me." I see Frank Mutlar, of course. In fact, he said he might call again this evening. Frank called, but he said he could not stop, as he had a friend waiting outside for him named Murray Posh, adding he was quite a swell. Carrie asked Frank to bring him in. He was brought in, Gowing entering at the same time. Mr. Murray Posh was a tall, fat young man, and was evidently of a very nervous disposition. As he subsequently confessed, He would never go in a hansom cab, nor would he enter a four-wheeler until the driver had first got on the box with the reins in his hands. On being introduced, Gowing, with his usual want of tact, said, "Any relation to Posh's 3-shilling hats?" Mr. Posh replied, "Yes, but please understand I don't try on hats myself. I take no active part in the business." I replied, "I wish I had a business like it." Mr. Posh seemed pleased, and gave a long but most interesting history of the extraordinary difficulties in the manufacture of cheap hats. Murray Posh evidently knew Daisy Mutlar very intimately from the way he was talking of her, and Frank said to Lupin once, laughingly, "If you don't look out, Posh will cut you out." When they had all gone, I referred to this flippant conversation, and Lupin said, sarcastically, "A man who is jealous has no respect for himself. A man who would be jealous of an elephant like Murray Posh could only have contempt for himself. I know Daisy. She would wait 10 years for me, as I said before. In fact, if necessary, she would wait 20 years for me." End of chapter. The Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith, read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 16. We lose money over Lupin's advice as to investment, so does Cummings. Murray Posh engaged to Daisy Mutlar. February the 18th. Carrie has several times recently called attention to the thinness of my hair at the top of my head, and recommended me to get it seen to. I was this morning trying to look at it by the aid of a small hand-glass, when somehow my elbow caught against the edge of the chest of drawers and knocked the glass out of my hand and smashed it. Carrie was in an awful way about it, as she is rather absurdly superstitious. To make matters worse, my large photograph in the drawing-room fell during the night and the glass cracked. Carrie said, "Mark my words, Charles, some misfortune is about to happen." I said, "Nonsense, dear." In the evening, Lupin arrived home early and seemed a little agitated. I said, "What's up, my boy?" He hesitated a good deal, and then said, "You know those parachica chlorates I advised you to invest £20 in?" I replied, "Yes, they are all right, I trust." He replied, "Well, no, to the surprise of everybody, they have utterly collapsed." My breath was so completely taken away I could say nothing. Carrie looked at me and said, "What did I tell you?" Lupin, after a while, said, "However, you are specially fortunate. I received an early tip and sold out yours immediately, and was fortunate to get £2 for them. So you get something after all." I gave a sigh of relief. I said I was not so sanguine as to suppose, as you predicted, that I should get 6 or 8 times the amount of my investment. Still, a profit of £2 is a good percentage for such a short time. Lupin said quite irritably, "You don't understand. I sold your £20 shares for £2. You therefore lose £18 on the transaction, whereby Cummings and Gowing will lose the whole of theirs." February the 19th. Lupin, before going to town, said, "I'm very sorry about those parachica chlorates. It would not have happened if the boss, Job Cleanands, had been in town. Between ourselves, you must not be surprised if something goes wrong at our office. Job Cleanands has not been seen in the last few days, and it strikes me several people do want to see him, very particularly." In the evening, Lupin was just on the point of going out to avoid a collision with Gowing and Cummings, when the former entered the room without knocking, but with his usual trick of saying, "May I come in?" He entered, and, to the surprise of Lupin and myself, seemed to be in the very best of spirits. Neither Lupin nor I broached the subject to him, but he did so of his own accord. He said, "I say, those parachica chlorates have gone an awful smash. You're a nice one, Master Lupin. How much do you lose?" Lupin, to my utter astonishment, said, "Oh, I had nothing in them. There was some informality in my application. I forgot to enclose the cheque or something, and I didn't get any. The Gov loses £18. I said I quite understood you were in it, or nothing would have induced me to speculate. Lupin replied, "Well, it can't be helped. You must go double on the next tip." Before I could reply, Gowing said, "Well, I lose nothing, fortunately. From what I heard, I did not quite believe in them, so I persuaded Cummings to take my £15 worth, as he had more faith in them than I had." Lupin burst out laughing, and in the most unseemly manner said, "Alas, poor Cummings, he'll lose £35." At that moment there was a ring at the bell. Lupin said, "I don't want to meet Cummings." If he had gone out of the door, he would have met him in the passage, so as quickly as possible Lupin opened the parlour window and got out. Gowing jumped up suddenly, exclaiming, "I don't want to see him either," and before I could say a word he followed Lupin out of the window. For my own part, I was horrified to think that my own son and one of my most intimate friends should depart from the house like a couple of interrupted burglars. Poor Cummings was very upset, and naturally was very angry both with Lupin and Gowing. I pressed him to have a little whisky, and he replied he had given up whisky, but would like a little unsweetened, as he was advised it was the most healthy spirit. I had none in the house, but sent Sarah round to Lockwood's for some. February 20th. The first thing that caught my eye on opening the Standard was "Great failure of stock and share dealers. Mr. Job Cleanands absconded." I handed it to Carrie, and she replied, "Oh, perhaps it's for Lupin's good. I never did think it a suitable situation for him." I thought the whole affair very shocking. Lupin came down to breakfast, and seeing he looked painfully distressed, I said, "We know the news, my dear boy, and feel very sorry for you." Lupin said, "How did you know? Who told you?" I handed him the Standard. He threw the paper down and said, "Oh, I don't care a button for that. I expected that, but I did not expect this." He then read a letter from Frank Mutlar, announcing in a cool manner that Daisy Mutlar is to be married next month to Murray Posh. I exclaimed, "Murray Posh? Is not that the very man Frank had the impudence to bring here last Tuesday week?" Lupin said, "Yes, the Posh's 3-shilling hats chap." We all then ate our breakfast in dead silence. In fact, I could eat nothing. I was not only too worried, but I cannot and will not eat cushion of bacon. If I cannot get streaky bacon, I will do without anything. When Lupin rose to go, I noticed a malicious smile creep over his face. I asked him what it meant. He replied, "Oh, only a little consolation. Still, it is a consolation. I have just remembered that by my advice Mr. Murray Posh has invested £600 in Parachika chlorates." End of chapter. The Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith. Read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 17. Marriage of Daisy Mutlar and Murray Posh. The dream of my life realised. Mr. Perkupp takes Lupin into the office. March 20th. Today being the day on which Daisy Mutlar and Mr. Murray Posh are to be married, Lupin has gone with a friend to spend the day at Gravesend. Lupin has been much cut up over the affair, although he declares that he is glad it is off. I wish he would not go to so many music halls, but one dare not say anything to him about it. At the present moment he irritates me by singing all over the house some nonsense about "What's the matter with Gladstone? He's all right. What's the matter with Lupin? He's all right." I don't think either of them is. In the evening Gowing called, and the chief topic of conversation was Daisy's marriage to Murray Posh. I said I was glad the matter was at an end, as Daisy would only have made a fool of Lupin. Gowing, with his usual good taste, said, "Oh, Master Lupin can make a fool of himself without any assistance." Carrie very properly resented this, and Gowing had sufficient sense to say he was sorry. March 21st. To-day I shall conclude my diary, for it is one of the happiest days of my life. My great dream of the last few weeks, in fact, of many years, has been realised. This morning came a letter from Mr. Perkupp asking me to take Lupin down to the office with me. I went to Lupin's room, Poor fellow, he seemed very pale, and said he had a bad headache. He had come back yesterday from Gravesend, where he spent part of the day in a small boat on the water, having been mad enough to neglect to take his overcoat with him. I showed him Mr. Perkupp's letter, and he got up as quickly as possible. I begged of him not to put on his fast-coloured clothes and ties, but to dress in something black or quiet-looking. Carrie was all of a tremble when she read the letter, and all she could keep on saying was, "Oh, I do hope it will be all right." For myself, I could scarcely eat any breakfast. Lupin came down dressed quietly and looking a perfect gentleman, except that his face was rather yellow. Carrie, by way of encouragement, said, "You do look nice, Lupin." Lupin replied, "Yes, it's a good make-up, isn't it? A regular, downright, respectable, funereal, first-class, city firm junior clerk." He laughed rather ironically. In the hall I heard a great noise, and also Lupin shouting to Sarah to fetch down his old hat. I went into the passage and found Lupin in a fury, kicking and smashing a new tall hat. I said, "Lupin, my boy, what are you doing? How wicked of you! Some poor fellow would be glad to have it." Lupin replied, I would not insult any poor fellow by giving it to him. When he had gone outside, I picked up the battered hat and saw inside, "Posh's patent." Poor Lupin, I can forgive him. It seemed hours before we reached the office. Mr. Perkupp sent for Lupin, who was with him nearly an hour. He returned, as I thought, crestfallen in appearance. I said, "Well, Lupin, how about Mr. Perkupp?" Lupin commenced his song, "What's the matter with Perkupp? He's all right." I felt instinctively my boy was engaged. I went to Mr. Perkupp, but I could not speak. He said, "Well, Mr. Pooter, what is it?" I must have looked a fool, for all I could say was, "Mr. Perkupp, you're a good man." He looked at me for a moment and said, "No, Mr. Pooter, you are the good man, and we'll see if we cannot get your son to follow such an excellent example." I said, "Mr. Perkupp, may I go home? I cannot work any more to-day." My good master shook my hand warmly as he nodded his head. It was as much as I could do to prevent myself from crying in the bus. In fact, I should have done so had my thoughts not been interrupted by Lupin, who was having a quarrel with a fat man in the bus, whom he accused of taking up too much room. In the evening, Carrie sent round for dear old friend Cummings and his wife, and also to Gowing. We all sat round the fire, and in a bottle of Jackson Frere, which Sarah fetched from the grocer's, drank Lupin's health. I lay awake for hours thinking of the future. My boy in the same office as myself. We can go down together by the bus, come home together, and who knows but in the course of time he may take great interest in our little home, that he may help me to put a nail in here or a nail in there, or help his dear mother to hang a picture. In the summer he may help us in our little garden with the flowers, and assist us to paint the stands and the pots. By the by, I must get in some more enamel paint. And this I thought over and over again, and 1,000 happy thoughts beside. I heard the clock strike 4, and soon after fell asleep, only to dream of 3 happy people, Lupin, dear Carrie, and myself. End of chapter. The Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith. Read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 18. Trouble with a stylographic pen. We go to a volunteer ball, where I am let in for an expensive supper. Grossly insulted by a cabman. An odd invitation to Southend. April the 8th. No events of any importance, except that Gowing strongly recommended a new patent stylographic pen, which cost me 9 and 6pence, and which was simply 9 and 6pence thrown in the mud. It has caused me constant annoyance and irritability of temper. The ink oozes out of the top, making a mess on my hands, and once at the office, when I was knocking the palm of my hand on the desk to jerk the ink down, Mr. Perkupp, who had just entered, called out, "Stop that knocking! I suppose that is you, Mr. Pitt." The young monkey, Pitt, took a malicious glee in responding, quite loudly, "No, sir, I beg pardon, it is Mr. Pooter with his pen. It has been going on all the morning. To make matters worse, I saw Lupin laughing behind his desk. I thought it wiser to say nothing. I took the pen back to the shop and asked them if they would take it back, as it did not act. I did not expect the full price returned, but was willing to take half. The man said he could not do that. Buying and selling were two different things. Lupin's conduct during the period he has been in Mr. Perkupp's office has been most exemplary. My only fear is it is too good to last. April the 9th, Gowing called, bringing with him an invitation for Carrie and myself to a ball given by the East Acton Rifle Brigade, which he thought would be a swell affair, as the member for East Acton, Sir William Grime, had promised his patronage. We accepted of his kindness, and he stayed to supper, on occasion I thought suitable for trying a bottle of Algéra that Mr. James of Sutton had sent me as a present. Gowing sipped the wine, observing he had never tasted it before, and further remarked that his policy was to stick to more recognised brands. I told him it was a present from a dear friend, and one mustn't look a gift horse in the mouth. Gowing facetiously replied, and he didn't like putting it in the mouth either. I thought the remarks were rude without being funny, but on tasting it myself came to the conclusion there was some justification for them. The sparkling Algéra is very like cider, only more sour. I suggested that perhaps the thunder had turned it a bit acid. He merely replied, "Oh, I don't think so. We had a very pleasant game of cards, though I lost 4 shillings and Carrie lost 1, and Gowing said he had lost about 6pence. How he could have lost, considering that Carrie and I were the only other players, remains a mystery." April the 14th, Sunday. Owing, I presume, to the unsettled weather, I awoke with a feeling that my skin was drawn over my face as tight as a drum. Walking round the garden with Mr. and Mrs. Treen, members of our congregation, who had walked back with us, I was much annoyed to find a large newspaper full of bones on the gravel path, evidently thrown over by those young Griffin boys next door, who, whenever we have friends, climb up the empty steps inside their conservatory, tap at the windows, making faces, whistling and imitating birds. April the 15th. Burnt my tongue most awfully with the Worcester sauce, through that stupid girl Sarah shaking the bottle violently before putting it on the table. April the 16th, the night of the East Acton Volunteer Ball. On my advice, Carrie put on the same dress that she looked so beautiful in at the Mansion House. For it had occurred to me, being a military ball, that Mr. Perkupp, who, I believe, is an officer in the Honorary Artillery Company, would in all probability be present. Lupin, in his usual incomprehensible language, remarked that he had heard it was a bounder's ball. I didn't ask him what he meant, though I didn't understand. Where he gets these expressions from, I don't know. He certainly doesn't learn them at home. The invitation was for 8:30, so I concluded if we arrived an hour later we should be in good time without being unfashionable, as Mr. James says. It was very difficult to find, the cabman having to get down several times to inquire at different public houses where the drill hall was. I wonder at people living in such out-of-the-way places. No one seemed to know it. However, after going up and down a good many badly lighted streets, we arrived at our destination. I had no idea it was so far from Holloway. I gave the cabman 5 shillings, who only grumbled, saying it was dirt cheap at half a sovereign, and was impertinent enough to advise me the next time I went to a ball to take a bus. Captain Welcut received us, saying we were rather late, but that it was better late than never. He seemed a very good-looking gentleman, though, as Carrie remarked, rather short for an officer. He begged to be excused for leaving us, as he was engaged for a dance, and hoped we should make ourselves at home. Carrie took my arm, and we walked around the rooms 2 or 3 times and watched the people dancing. I couldn't find a single person I knew, but attributed it to most of them being in uniform. As we were entering the supper room, I received a slap on the shoulder, followed by a welcome shake of the hand. I said, "Mr. Padge, I believe." He replied, "That's right." I gave Carrie a chair, and seated by her was a lady who made herself at home with Carrie at once. There was a very liberal repast on the tables, plenty of champagne, claret, etc., and in fact everything seemed to be done regardless of expense. Mr. Padge is a man that, I admit, I have no particular liking for, but I felt so glad to come across someone I knew that I asked him to sit at our table, and I must say that for a short, fat man he looked well in uniform, although I think his tunic was rather baggy in the back. It was the only supper-room I have been in that was not overcrowded. In fact, we were the only people there, everybody being so busy dancing. I assisted Carrie and her newly formed acquaintance, who said her name was Lupin, to some champagne. Also myself, and handed the bottle to Mr. Padge to do likewise, saying, "You must look after yourself." He replied, "That's right," and poured out half a tumbler and drank Carrie's health, coupled, as he said, with her worthy lord and master. We all had some splendid pigeon pie and ices to follow. The waiters were very attentive and asked if we would like some more wine. I assisted Carrie and her friend and Mr. Padge, also some people who had just come from the dancing-room who were very civil. It occurred to me at the time that perhaps some of the gentlemen knew me in the city, as they were being so polite. I made myself useful and assisted several ladies to ices, remembering an old saying that there is nothing lost by civility. The band struck up for the dance, and they all went into the ballroom. The ladies, Carrie and Mrs. Lupin, were anxious to see the dancing, and as I had not quite finished my supper, Mr. Padge offered his arms to them and escorted them to the ballroom, telling me to follow. I said to Mr. Padge, "It is quite a West End affair," to which remark Mr. Padge replied, "That's right." When I had quite finished my supper and was leaving, the waiter who had been attending on us arrested my attention by tapping me on the shoulder. I thought it unusual for a waiter at a private ball to expect a tip, but nevertheless gave a shilling, as he had been very attentive. He smilingly replied, "I beg your pardon, sir, this is no good," alluding to the shilling. "Your party's had 4 suppers at 5 shillings a head, 5 ices at 1 shilling, 3 bottles of champagne at 11 and 6pence, a glass of claret, and a 6penny cigar for the stout gentleman. In all, £3, 0 shillings and 6pence. I didn't think I was ever so surprised in my life, and had only sufficient breath to inform him that I had received a private invitation, to which he answered that he was perfectly well aware of that, but that the invitation didn't include eatables and drinkables. A gentleman who was standing at the bar corroborated the waiter's statement, and assured me it was quite correct. The waiter said he was extremely sorry if I'd been under any misapprehension, but it was not his fault. Of course, there was nothing to be done but to pay, so after turning out my pockets, I just managed to scrape up sufficient, all but 9 shillings. But the manager, on my giving my card to him, said that's all right. I don't think I ever felt more humiliated in my life, and I determined to keep this misfortune from Carrie, or it would entirely destroy the pleasant evening she was enjoying. I felt there was no more enjoyment for me that evening, and it being late, I sought Carrie and Mrs. Lupin. Carrie said she was quite ready to go, and Mrs. Lupin, as we were wishing her good night, asked Carrie and myself if we ever paid a visit to Southend. On my replying that I hadn't been there for many years, she very kindly said, "Well, why don't you come down and stay at our place?" As her invitation was so pressing, and observing that Carrie wished to go, we promised we would visit her the next Saturday week and stay till Monday. Mrs. Lupin said she would write to us tomorrow, giving us the address and particulars of trains, etc. When we got outside the drill hall, it was raining so hard that the roads resembled canals, and I need hardly say we had great difficulty in getting a cabman to take us to Holloway. After waiting for a bit, a man said he would drive us anyhow as far as the Angel at Islington, and we could easily get another cab from there. It was a tedious journey. The rain was beating against the windows and trickling down the inside of the cab. When we arrived at the Angel, the horse seemed tired out. Carrie got out and ran into a doorway, and when I came to pay, to my absolute horror, I remembered I had no money, nor had Carrie. I explained to the cabman how we were situated. Never in my life have I ever been so insulted. The cabman, who was a rough bully and, to my thinking, not sober, called me every name he could lay his tongue to, and positively seized me by the beard, which he pulled till the tears came into my eyes. I took the number of a policeman who witnessed the assault for not taking the man in charge. The policeman said he couldn't interfere, that he had seen no assault, and that people should not ride in cabs without money. We had to walk home in the pouring rain, nearly 2 miles, and when I got in I put down the conversation I had had with the cabman, word for word, as I intend writing to the Telegraph, for the purpose of proposing that cabs should be driven only by men under government control, to prevent civilians being subjected to the disgraceful insult and outrage I had had to endure. April 17th, no water in our cistern again. Sent for Putley, who said he would soon remedy that, the cistern being zinc. April 18th, water all right again in the cistern. Mrs. James of Sutton called in the afternoon. She and Carrie draped the mantelpiece in the drawing-room and put little toy spiders, frogs and beetles all over it, as Mrs. James says it's quite the fashion. It was Mrs. James' suggestion, and of course Carrie always does what Mrs. James suggests. For my part, I preferred the mantelpiece as it was, but there, I am a plain man and don't pretend to be in the fashion. April 19th, our next-door neighbour, Mr. Griffin, called, and in a rather offensive tone accused me, or someone, of boring a hole in his cistern and letting out his water to supply our cistern, which adjoined his. He said he should have to have his repaired, and send us in the bill. April 20th, Cummings called, hobbling in with a stick, saying he had been on his back for a week. It appears he was trying to shut his bedroom door, which is situated just at the top of the staircase, and, unknown to him, a piece of cork the dog had been playing with had got between the door and prevented it shutting. And, in pulling the door hard, to give it an extra slam, the handle came off in his hands and he fell backwards downstairs. On hearing this, Lupin suddenly jumped up from the couch and rushed out of the room sideways. Cummings looked very indignant and remarked it was very poor fun, a man nearly breaking his back, and though I had my suspicions that Lupin was laughing, I assured Cummings that he had only run out to open the door to a friend he expected. Cummings said this was the second time he had been laid up, and we had never sent to inquire. I said I knew nothing about it. Cummings said it was mentioned in the Bicycle News. April 22nd. I have of late frequently noticed Carrie rubbing her nails a good deal with an instrument, and on asking her what she was doing, she replied, "Oh, I'm going in for manicuring. It's all the fashion now." I said, "I suppose Mrs. James introduced that into your head?" Carrie laughingly replied, "Yes, but everyone does it now." I wish Mrs. James wouldn't come to the house. Whenever she does, she always introduces some new-fangled rubbish into Carrie's head. One of these days, I feel sure, I shall tell her she's not welcome. I'm sure it was Mrs. James who put Carrie up to writing on dark slate-coloured paper with white ink. Nonsense. April 23rd. Received a letter from Mrs. Lupin of Southend, telling us the train to come by on Saturday, and hoping we'll keep our promise to stay with her. The letter concluded, "You must come and stay at our house. We shall charge you half what you will have to pay at the Royal, and the view is every bit as good." Looking at the address at the top of the notepaper, I found it was Lupkin's Family and Commercial Hotel. I wrote a note saying we were compelled to decline her kind invitation. Carrie thought this very satirical and to the point. By the by, I will never choose another cloth pattern at night. I ordered a new suit of dittos for the garden at Edwards, and chose the pattern by gaslight, and they seemed to be a quiet pepper and salt mixture with white stripes down. They came home this morning, and, to my horror, I found it was quite a flash-looking suit. There was a lot of green with bright yellow-coloured stripes. I tried on the coat and was annoyed to find Carrie giggling. She said, "What mixture did you say you asked for?" I said, "A quiet pepper and salt." Carrie said, "Well, it looks more like mustard, if you want to know the truth." End of chapter.